After I was diagnosed with SPD, one of the first things I did was go home and research it more. And in doing that research, I started to find that there were it seemed to be like a lot of confusion in the community where some schizoids would experience one thing and then some of the other schizoids would experience other things. But amongst all of it, I did notice that there seemed to be two different almost styles of schizoids where one was a little bit more popular than the other. I would say probably like maybe a 70-30 split, where there was a larger portion of the community that seemed to want connection. They desired it, but it was either too overwhelming or too intrusive where, they couldn't do it. And so they're in this kind of like cycle, which is called the schizoid dilemma, right? And then the other one where they don't even have a desire for connection. It just doesn't even exist for them. So I put together this chart that kind of puts all in kind of one easy to see place of the information and data I've collected that displays this. And I labeled it internal schizoid and external schizoid. The internal being where detachment happens. And with the external schizoid, it's an absence of connection. And I believe that everything that you see that I placed on this chart on the left and the right, these all stem from either the detachment aspect from the internal schizoid or the absence of connection from the external. That whenever there's a trait or an experience, generally, because everything's on a general term, right? Not everything is exactly, and sometimes people can feel one way or the other. Like a extroverted person can sometimes have introverted moments, right? You may think they're an introvert but an extrovert, and vice versa. So this is, in general, I listed out things where, and I'll go over it briefly, but I'm not going to go over every single word here. But basically, for the internal schizoid, you have where the core main issue is detachment. So there's something to detach from, meaning that a connection exists or may be possible, but they distance themselves from it. And that's as a means to protect themselves. Again, due to being overwhelmed or just maybe a feeling that they may lose their self autonomy. Where the external schizoid, the absence of connection, the connection isn't experienced in the first place. The connection is either weak or doesn't arise. There's simply little or no internal pull towards it. And I think this is the main theme between the two. And briefly, for the internal schizoid, the fundamental experience is distance, whereas for the external, it's absence. And the connection, it exists or it may be accessible. And for the connection on the external schizoid, it's either weak or it doesn't arise. And that's where the distance comes from, right? Because they put that wall up to distance themselves from that connection that exists or may be accessible. And the absence is basically for the external schizoid happening because either it's a weak, very weak connection, or it just doesn't arise at all. In very rare circumstances, there can be that connection that may arise, but generally it doesn't. And this will lead into other things like emotion, right? Emotion would naturally be of greater access when a connection is possible. Connection leads to emotions. And where with the external schizoid, there's reduced access to emotions just because there isn't situations where you're connecting with anything to experience any sense of emotion. Emotions would be very limited, like more so on that side of the aisle. And that leads to other things like subjective feeling, where you feel disconnected for the internal schizoid, subjective feeling for the external schizoid, where you don't feel a connection at all. into relationships where there's a withdrawal from relationships, family members. It could be somebody you're interested in dating, or a spouse. You know, you retreat to reduce the comfort or risk of that. And with the external schizoid, that would be in the relationship category, little internal pull towards connection, right? So that's going to, it's where the external schizoid engages if it makes sense, right? You're married, you have family members, you got to engage, right? But there's no inner drive to do so versus that internal schizoid where you are making an effort because you kind of feel a desire to, but then you withdraw because of discomfort that you're feeling, because maybe they are too overwhelming for you because they have so much emotion and you don't, or other risks to your autonomy and your own things that you want to do, where they're intruding on. And that leads to other things like solitude, where you end up becoming more isolated, right? To protect yourself. It's more of a safety thing. But the external schizoid, it does the same thing, but it's just more of a neutral thing, right? The external schizoid just simply doesn't have a connection, it feels. It doesn't want to be around people. There's no point, there's no reason. It's not defensive in nature. It's just, it is what it is. And then you have intimacy, which for the internal schizoid, intimacy may have more of a threatening or overwhelming feeling, right? The closeness will risk engulfment or a loss of autonomy, where the intimacy for the external schizoid, is just simply not desired. So, closeness to someone like a spouse, family member, just feels neutral, right? It's not threatening. Um, it's just not felt, but you still act accordingly to your situation, and everything stems from that. Then you have, like engulfment concerns where it's a potentially important risk for you as an internal schizoid. There's a fear of being controlled or intruded upon. And with the external schizoid, the engulfment concerns, it's not necessarily present, right? Fear of engulfment is not a defining factor of it. It's just that there's nothing for you to connect to, so you just don't want to be a part of anything. It's not that you feel engulfment necessarily. It's just that you can't connect to it. Everything inside of you just wants to be away from it and just in doing your own thing. And then you have, loneliness, where loneliness for internal schizoid, because that connection or desire for it does exist, then the loneliness can occur because that connection is desired. The distance can become painful. Whereas for the external schizoid, loneliness is either minimal or absent. And that's just because there's little sense of missing any sort of connection because it almost never arises. So there's no loneliness to be had, right? If there's no connection desired. And then the longing for others, very similar, where it is possible on the internal schizoid side, because again, there is that wish for closeness. But the external schizoid, the loneliness, that longing for others, there's often or little, there's often little or none of it, which means that, the desire for closeness is rare or absent. So longing for others, uh, it never happens. I know for myself, it's like literally never happened. And this brings us to the big one, right? The schizoid dilemma. And I mean, everybody's heard of that. Once you learn you have this disorder and you've done a little bit of research, it's one of the first things will come up. And that's where with the internal schizoid, it fits, right? It fits particularly well. There's that desire for connection, but the closest is uncomfortable. There's the withdrawal, and then the desire for connection returns. And it's this vicious cycle. With the external schizoid, however, it just may be entirely absent. There is no cycle. A connection isn't desired. And when, like, listening to or reading what other schizoids are saying, listening to a schizoid I know, you see it. Some people literally just they don't have a desire. They don't get the schizoid dilemma. It's not there. It's completely absent. And that's, like I said, probably about 30% of the community, if I had to guess, would be like that. So it's definitely the minority, not the majority. Then the fantasy world. I notice a difference in fantasy worlds. Like I notice a lot of internal schizoids that I would classify as internal, where they desire connection. They have that schizoid dilemma. Will generally their fantasy world, and again, this is just general. It could be experienced in a different way, but generally, it's like through lucid dreaming or daydreaming, even like reading, where basically you're going internal, where you create a fantasy world in your head and you can experience it through lucid dreaming. I've seen people with the schizoid dilemma describe their inner fantasy world, and it's actually really cool. It's interesting. It's the ability to create this very lucid world um, seems really cool. But it's something that I've noticed differs a lot with the what I would call the external schizoid, because the fantasy world in that case generally is experienced through external tools. Could be things like digital art software, word, like world building types of programs. Video games is a good one, right? Where you can, create something in an external thing like a video game and experience the world in whatever way you want. It's not in your head, but you're taking your thoughts and ideas and putting it into something that's more external than internal, is the idea behind that. And then, basically the central metaphor I came up with for these two things is the internal schizoid, like I said, detachment. you know, there's that wall that separates essentially the schizoid from whatever it is that there could be a possible connection with. This wall separates me from you, is what I put there. And the general metaphor for the external schizoid is, like I said, absence of connection, where there's just no bridge connecting between the schizoid or with anything else. So there's no bridge between us to begin with. And, I put like a little graphic at the bottom to kind of visualize that, where detachment, there's a connection, but you distance yourself from it. And for the external schizoid, I put a little graph there, a little picture there to show the absence of connection. There's no connection to experience in the first place. And when you look in the middle there, you can see, both can produce the same outward patterns: solitude, few close relationships, emotional distance, limited social motivation. And there's some other ones, but those are generally the ones that whenever you're observing somebody, talking to someone, you can see these patterns. Everybody in the schizoid community, from what I've seen, exhibits these things. And so, you can see that, oh, this person might be a schizoid. But then when you look a little deeper, the reasons as to why they're exhibiting these outward patterns, that's where it can be different. And I've noticed that the difference, no matter how much I think about it, no matter how much I play it out, it really all comes down to there seems to be this schizoid dilemma where there is an intentional detachment, a protective mechanisms where you detach from whatever person that is, whatever connection that's possible. You detach from it to protect himself from intrusion, from maybe a sense of being overwhelmed by someone's emotions. So detachment is the center theme that everything else extends from, where the absence of connection that I call the external schizoid, there seems to be a smaller group where there is an absence of connection, where that connection, it either doesn't exist or just maybe in some cases it will very, very rarely arise. And this would be the reason why you will see that some schizoids, they don't experience that schizoid dilemma. And they'll say they don't get anxiety being around people. They don't have any problem with it. They just don't have a desire for it. They can't connect. They can go to work, they can have a job, but they prefer not to be around people. If they're at work, they would probably have They want to be in the corner somewhere away from everybody. You know, they're not going to be sitting at the table with everybody talking. They're going to get their food and just be by themselves. But it's not because they're threatened. It's not because of anything. It's just they can't connect with that. Um, and when it really comes down to it, though, if no matter what kind of schizoid you are, this is something else I notice, internal, external, as I put it here. If you have the schizoid dilemma, if you don't, if you're forced to be around a bunch of people, eventually that will definitely weigh on you because we just don't have the ability to be in that space, whether it's for a detachment reason or just a lack of connection in the first place. But that's pretty much it. It was on my mind. I'm dealing with some things in my life that makes me think a lot about these things, and so I wanted to share it. And also, if there's people who are new to, they just found out they have this disorder and they're confused, maybe this can help. So go ahead, clip it. You can save this here. Take a screenshot, and maybe it'll be useful for some people. That's all I got for you today. Take care.